This is The Strategy Inside Everything. I'm Adam Pierno. The Strategy Inside Everything is the podcast for people who think for a living. If this conversation gives you an idea, leads to a question, or makes you want to push back on something you hear, go to that'snotaninsight.com, where you can leave a message or send me a voicemail. The best and most interesting will be added to the future episodes, and I can't wait to hear from you. All right, welcome back to another episode of The Strategy Inside Everything. Really looking forward. I am full of hope. I am motivated. I am excited to have this conversation today with our guest. He's the principal and managing director at Sylvain. It's Joey Camire. Joey, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me on. I'm glad that you are prefacing your emotional valence before the conversation.
Oh, well, buddy, I am tapped into my emotions at all time. No, I am emotionally immature, I think. But for the purposes of our conversation today, I'm emphasizing my engagement.
Perfect. Yeah, I will tell you my emotional valence is cautiously optimistic, but generally positive.
Okay, those are great. Those are great words. Nice, well done. I know exactly where you are. So if you wouldn't mind, Joey, before we get going, would you give people a sense of what you've done and where you've been?
Yeah. So I grew up in New Hampshire. Maybe that's relevant. Maybe it's not. But I was the first person in my family to go to college on either side. And so I had no idea what I wanted to do. I got to college. I studied neuroscience and psychology. I loved it in theory. I was lucky enough to get placed as a graduate assistant while I was in undergrad in a sensation and perception lab, a sort of neuroscience lab, and realized I hated it in practice. Like the lab just was sort of constitutionally opposed to who I am. A lot of isolation. A lot of people who are drawn to that line of work are not particularly social, did not like me even just, saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to them. And I sort of took a left turn. I was like all prepped to apply to PhD programs. And I went to career services one day. I was like, what are my other options? It was like my 8th semester. And they were like, you could go to grad school for this thing. I applied to the now VCU Brand Center. It was the VCU Ad Center at the time, and got in and sort of pursued this track in strategy sort of more broadly. I came out, me and a friend that I had made, and we sort of, because of alphabetical order, we're getting partnered every semester on projects, but we really developed a rhythm with one another and just sort of had a level of simpatico and sort of compensatory skills for one another that we sold ourselves as a team coming out of grad school, a strategy team, which it didn't exist and I think still doesn't exist, but we were able to get a job at the bottom of the recession. Like we were among the first people to get a job as a team, which was sort of surprising, I think, to all the teachers who told us not to do that. And then we sort of found ourselves in a bit of a toxic environment. We had become friends with Alain Sylvain, the namesake of the company, and he was sort of in a similar situation where he had been in a really vibrant culture. The first non-partner employee at Mother New York helped sort of set up Mother New York, the advertising agency. And he had gone on to another place, had an allergic reaction. And so we were kind of coming in this situation where we're like, hey, do you know anywhere we should be looking to find a new job? And he was like, hold on, let's talk. And he was looking to start a company. We were looking to do something new. We were excited at the prospect. And so, the three of us started the company in 2010. And now, I guess 12 and a half years later, here we are. We faked it till we made it, and so far so good.
That's amazing. That's some pretty good luck down from alphabetical order to getting that first gig as the team. Like good fortune. What do you attribute that to?
I think, just sort of like seizing the cards that you're given and trying to make the most of it. I think it was sort of, there was one professor, a guy named Charles Hall, who was sort of, I still sort of attribute our decision to come out of school as a team to him giving, like, everyone told us no. He was the one person that sent us an email after we had like won some competition at the end of our first year of school. And he had come just to watch teams present and things like that. And he sent us an email that the subject was like Sampras and Agassi. And he had written Jordan's Dear Basketball letter, and he was just is still an incredible writer. And he wrote us this short email that was just so potent. And I responded, I was like, this is like the nicest thing that anyone has ever said to me, that, he was talking about us going back and forth and playing off of each other. And it was just sort of poetry. And I was like, everyone's telling us not to do this. And he's like, why do you care what they think? And I was like, you're right, I don't. So let's do it. I think it's just been a series of situations that we've been presented with and trying to make the most of it. Maybe, in the vein of some of the conversations that we're going to have, just like having a certain amount of an optimistic outlook, I guess, and saying like, here's what we got, what can we do with it? And, here we are.
Are you an optimist by nature?
I think I've been thinking about this a bunch recently, both for this conversation and some of the things that I've written about recently, but also, just like a certain amount of introspection and self-awareness. And I think I am defiant in some ways. Like, I don't like being told what to do, and I don't like telling other people what to do in sort of a decisive fashion. And so when you're sort of presented with a set of circumstances and it seems unlikely that you can make something happen, there is like that challenge of being like, well, why couldn't we make that? Like that idea of like signs are pointing you in one direction, and the ability to sort of persist or defy what, prevailing wisdom may be excites me for good, bad, or other. And so, I think maybe that is sort of like in a vein of optimism, where presented with a context, I'm sort of optimistic in, the people that I'm surrounded by and my own abilities, that there is some solution that could be figured out. Maybe I just don't like being told no, even by like the universe or whatever it is,
I don't think most people do like it, but I don't think they have the awareness to recognize the universe is speaking when some of those weird things happen. So you and I were talking about, oh man, what are all the nicknames for the current employment? The great reshuffling is the one. Yeah, the great resignation. But I've been calling it the great reshuffling because I think more people are jumping until this quarter, when it seems like there are layoffs happening and the tide may be turning. But it was initially reported as everybody's resigning and sort of implying that people are just leaving the job market, which I don't know about. I don't know if people are just retiring outright. I'm more aligned with the idea
the FIRE movement has really taken off.
Yeah.
Everyone's retiring at 28.
Yeah. I mean, who needs to work? They gave us stimulus 14 months ago and it was almost $1,000. So you're probably set for life, right?
Yeah, good for life. If you put it in a good mutual fund, you will have approximately $750 now. So
you can manage the hell out of that money.
Yeah.
But however you describe that, I think you and I were talking about the mood among workers, the mood among employees, among people in their jobs is probably the better way to say it, putting the humanity first. What have you observed?
I mean, I think, I'm I'm fascinated by complex systems, right? So many of these things that we're talking about when you're discussing sort of macroeconomics or sort of social mood or sort of broad attitudinal dynamics as it relates to the job market, there are so many influences that factor into these discussions that it's important to say, like, you can sort of make hypotheses, but it's always going to be more complicated or more complex than that. But sort of analyzing it, I think it's important to first say that there is sort of a age related, like, demographic component to this discussion. Whether or not people explicitly state that in, whether it's like big New York Times think pieces or Atlantic think pieces or wherever, like, sometimes they will state it, sometimes they won't, but there is sort of a large generational divide within this context. And I think a lot of that has to do with the young people today are sort of facing a number of sort of disadvantaged positions in one capacity or the other, right? Student loan debt, systemic racism, environmental problems, the sort of inability to own a home while sort of contending with the need to work from home. Like, all of these dynamics, I think, factor in, but I bring a bunch of those up because I think a lot of it has to do with sort of the ability to exert control and autonomy within different contexts. And I think, when we talk about sort of traditional corporate structures, inherently younger people will correlate with less power, right? Like, not to say that there aren't like wonderkins that are sort of accelerating up the corporate ladder faster than other people, but sort
there
of
are exceptions
as a group. Yeah. And so when you look at all of those other social factors and then decisions being made on restructuring and rethinking about the way that we're working, where in most cases, I think younger people weren't getting the opportunity to necessarily participate in those discussions, you're sort of stacking all of these factors that are sort of a reduction in the amount of autonomy, control, ability to sort of exert will on the forces that are sort of changing your life. The pandemic, right? Like,
right. Yeah, don't forget the global
forces.
Pandemic that's still going on.
Yeah. The result is sort of a feeling that has grown, and now more and more people seem to be writing about it. And when I first started thinking about it, it was sort of observational and anecdotal, and I began to try and see if I could find if other people had written more intelligently or researched more deeply this idea of sort of like an increasing feeling of nihilism within work or maybe beyond work. And it seems like that does exist, sort of this idea of like, effectively nihilism is about the idea that like life is meaningless or decisions are meaningless, or sort of is, from my perspective, coming from like a psychology and neuroscience background, I immediately go to sort of learned helplessness, right? That any sort of will that you're exerting has no impact or ability to sort of change your conditions. And so that feeling of learned helplessness can pervade, where I've tried all of these things to adjust my situation. And so looking at things like the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffle or people trying to adjust, like that is sort of this final thing that you do have control over. And so people like making decisions to say like, well, I'm just not going to work here anymore. Like, I don't even necessarily, I'm not going to like think about all of the sort of carry on effects anymore. Like, I have a set of values. These values are being sort of reinforced in my social circles. And I feel strongly enough that I'm going to like roll the dice and go out into the market. And lucky for most people, I guess, the the job environment over the past 2 years has been such that like it was a sort of like a demand side market or however you might talk about it, where employees had the power to be able to start to make decisions and exert control. And maybe that is sort of like a way to contend with the nihilism is the ability to sort of find places where you do have control and exert it.
Is it about, you mentioned a couple different avenues there as it relates to work. Is it more about the values aligning for the individual and their place of work or their supervisor? Or is it more about control and having some element of control over their work product, their day-to-day? Because if you read the back and forth about people who love the idea of remote work and that's the only way it should be, or people that are hell-bent on getting everybody back to the office, I fall squarely in the middle. I really don't care. But it matters a hell of a lot to a lot of very vocal people on both parts of that spectrum for whatever reason. The idea of working remotely seems to be you have more agency, you have more control, you have more time for yourself. But as you were explaining your setup, it's like, but it also could be a constant reminder for someone that they are in a home they don't love, they don't own, and it's like just a different kind of cubicle that they have to pay for themselves. Is that part of it?
Yeah. I mean, I think when you're thinking about like the remote work situation, it's really important, not that I've looked for it, but I haven't seen anything where people are normalizing the data based on sort of, leadership or managerial positions within a company. I can tell you, we write these things called like off-white papers sometimes. And we wrote one after we'd sort of maybe 3 or 4 months into the pandemic, myself and other leaders at the company were like talking to leaders in other companies and saying like, what are you doing? What's going on? I was talking to clients who are in leadership roles of, what are the things you're contending with? How are you responding to them? What's working? What's not? Just everyone seemed to be sharing information at that point. And so we wrote something about, I think that we called it distributed, not divided was the name of the off-white paper. And it was basically about like, what are the things that we should factor when designing new modes of work? And thinking about the fact that like being in an office, like as a leader, for me, having everyone in the same place acts as sort of like an extended sensory system for me if I'm paying attention. Like I can see who's having a problem. This team seems to be like moving fluidly and like they're all in high spirits, but this team isn't, or this individual isn't. Like I get a larger amount of data for myself to be able to maintain the culture or people's morale or happiness or conditions, whatever, or faster signals when something goes sideways. And so for me, that is effective. Now, as an individual, I'm also an extrovert. I'm highly social. Like all of those conditions also sort of push me in the direction of like, I was coming to the office every day when no one else was even coming. I have ADHD, like having that rhythm and structure to my week acts as sort of a scaffolding for me to not think about a bunch of other things and focus where I need to.
Right.
But everyone in our company doesn't have all of those same conditions. And so I think what we're starting to see in the way that people are writing about this is now, whatever, 2.5 years in, they're starting to, if you think back to like the first 3, 6, 9 months, it was this overwhelming cry for like freedom of work, remote work is going to rule. All like the SaaS companies were like, now's the time for Airtable or whatever,
Yes.
And
I'm surprised Airtable got on board with that. I would have thought Airtable and Slack would have been like, no, let's proceed thoughtfully. No, just kidding.
Now you're starting to see the conversations about like where the trade-offs are. I mean, and there were some thoughtful pieces written at the time around like the understanding of like strong and weak link connections within the work environment, and how in remote work, strong link connections were strengthening, meaning like the 5 people that you felt the strongest relationship with in your company, you were getting closer to in remote work. But all of the weak link connections were sort of like withering. Or if you're thinking of like a network diagram, those connectors were thinning. And there's a lot of benefit to weak link connections, both for like social support, morale, as well as sort of like serendipitous ideas. There's also sort of the idea of like culture. How do you maintain culture across digital mediums when, people are still people, where like we had a million years of design between like Australopithecus and Homo sapiens to make us more and more social, and whatever 2.5 years to try and make digital products to like equate that thing. So
yeah, somehow the absurd traditions of office culture, like birthday parties and
mm-hmm.
just some of the stuff that has always been a little bit verite anyway, got really blown out when it's happening digitally and everybody's on a Zoom call having birthday cake that they ordered from Uber Eats or something. It's like, what are we doing? We don't have to carry this part over we don't have to find a digital version of every single thing that we used to do in the office.
Did everyone get their individual cupcake to celebrate Janet's birthday?
Yeah, exactly. All the May birthdays. Like, it's all the corny stuff that offices have always done, but we tried to figure out how to make it exactly the same. Instead of saying like, well, maybe that's not what culture is. And maybe that's why people tap out of it, because I can remember being young in a big company and like opting out of all that stuff just because I was like, I don't know, this is socially awkward. I feel weird. If I want to talk to people, I could just go to their desk and talk to them. I don't want to go sing happy birthday to all the people who had a birthday this month. It's weird.
Forced fun, right? Yeah. I like, it sort of coincides with some of the discussions that people have had around the distinction between productivity and performance, right? Like, not just did you sort of invest hours, and like, can you point to the fact that like you did a thing within those hours, which is sort of where productivity is oriented. It feels like very much a product of like manufacturing and industrial culture versus performance. Like, the idea is a bit more on like, what were the outcomes? And I think that sort of transition and the confrontation that the pandemic has had is, I think, writ large, sort of forcing work culture, or at least, professional, like knowledge work culture. I don't want to speak outside of the domains that I exist in, to contend with problems, right? Like, if you look at it from a scientific perspective, there have been lots of pieces written about, like, journal articles and, economists writing about, like, I remember reading at one point, like 53 hours in a week is where you top out on, like, you sort of reach the point of diminishing returns on the number of hours that you invest. And yet companies that are, like whatever white shoe law firms and big four consulting companies are still pushing people to 70 plus hours per week, even though the data suggests that like the outcomes are not going to equate. And so like contending with that idea of like time versus outcome, and, sitting over someone's shoulder and making sure that they were in at 9 o'clock and they were there until 6:30 or something, was like never an effective way to sort of get positive outcomes out of your team or your talent, or however you want to talk about it. And I think, I will tell you, like, as just a sort of, I don't know, anecdotal example, I think we realized as a company that we sort of had this like deposit in the bank when we came into the pandemic of like goodwill from our team, because so much of our culture had always been sort of around autonomy, around sort of like embracing diversity in all its facets. Like, yes, like demographic diversity, but also sort of cognitive diversity and these other things, and allowing people sort of the autonomy to make decisions and guide things in the way that they saw fit, sort of meeting some quality standard, but the way in which you do it is sort of left to your devices. And I think we benefited in those early days of the pandemic as a result of those things, both that we had built up the muscle to be sort of a little bit more distributed, as well as the fact that like our team, appreciated that like it was going to be more of the same, and they kind of locked arms at the beginning of the pandemic. Like we all locked arms together and said like, okay, how are we going to keep everyone employed, facing this massive issue?
So, but it seems like in your case, you were able to translate the positive things that were happening in office culture and operation that you had built. And you've said, okay, well, we're just going to translate the good stuff anyway, because these are things that people enjoy or they appreciate or makes them more productive. So do you think, it sounds like you were better positioned to handle the let's go remote overnight situation, or was it just, hey, we're going to operate by giving people this, by trusting people and giving them this autonomy, and then we just kind of a continuation of those same policies?
I think in like the ways of working, we were sort of prepared. Like we already had people working across multiple offices. We already had people using digital platforms that, could be asynchronous and remote for building and conducting work. So, and I don't think that is particularly unique to us, but certainly we had that. But I think because we had a culture that sort of made it, psychologically safe for people to show up to work and bring themselves, like we weren't just like making it okay to bring yourself to the work. We were sort of like encouraging and trying to create the conditions. And so we had a level of goodwill at the beginning of the pandemic to try and figure out how we were going to create culture remotely. And I can't say that, we've done it great or poorly. The reality is like in that force fun type of stuff that you were talking about, we've just cycled through new things more quickly. Like this thing works or it doesn't. If it doesn't work, like, can it try a new thing? Like one of the more successful things just on like a cultural level that we've done is on Fridays we do versus the, like playing off of the internet sort of content platform where they pair two artists like playing their hits together. We just do that off of like weird concepts on Friday. Two people compete playing songs against like, like reggaeton songs or 1990s R&B.
You just
like,
give them categories.
Pop charts. Yeah, they can invent. Like we had one that was like bangers that make you cry. Like like it's just like absurd things, but people get to show up. It's participatory. It's fun. It's like a net new thing every week, and so that has been successful. It's sort of like an event that everyone is trying to go to and make sure they don't like schedule client meetings around it and stuff like that. And so, it has to be an experiment and sort of like a natural product of the team. But I think the bigger thing is like in that case, again, coming back to that autonomy and your ability to participate in your environment, like that idea came from someone on the team, and they were like, yeah, let's do it. We've tested lots of other ideas from people across the team, and you can't be like precious or like that would never work, or that's like, that's not my idea. It's like, okay, like, let's see if that works. And it did. And it's been, like a super net positive for like the cultural sort of morale.
And you can do it until it doesn't work.
Exactly.
You don't have to
if
sign
people
up
stop showing
forever.
up, we won't do it anymore.
Yeah, right. It'll stop serving its purpose of bringing people together.
Yeah.
But I gave you 5 questions in a row a while back, and so I want to come back. You talked about autonomy, but I had put in a string of questions that I blurted out about values too. And when you were laying out the case for some of the younger people in the workforce opting out, part of it was values based. And is that the values, their personal values aligning with the company mission? Is it purpose based, or is it just like, you don't treat people nice and I don't want to be here because I have a value that I put on myself and my time, or all?
Yeah. I think the honest answer is probably all, but I think, in ways, I don't want to say that it wasn't happening in the past, but I think because we're sort of contending with such a number generationally of sort of systemic issues, there is this orientation from younger people. And I'm a geriatric millennial. I would still like consider myself in this cohort of money and like financial gain is not like my primary motivator. I know there are things that I could sort of probably go and pursue that would be like more, fiscally positive for myself. But like, I want to come to work and be happy. I want to come to work and feel like I can be myself, and that I'm in a place that allows sort of for, I mentioned earlier, like I have ADHD, like there is sort of some aspects of like neurodiversity that I just have to operate slightly differently and be in a place where that can work. Also, though, the fact that like, I don't want to come and work for a company that's not like in the professional services context, like a client is disinterested in sort of making things better if it is possible. And so like all of those things add up. I can tell you, within the context of the Great Resignation and all of that, like we were a B Corp in like 2017, I think is when we officially got our B Corp status. But the number of people who applied for jobs or were sort of, looking at that idea of like, I want my time to be invested towards making some sort of positive impact and change in the world was significant. Like the majority of people who are applying for jobs were sort of like starting in their like cover letter or
they were
whatever
seeking
with
that
that
out.
sort of idea. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So there's a value alignment that you're seeing right from jump.
Yeah. And I think when you work in a place where your sort of values feel irrelevant, like any movement in that direction is going to feel positive. I think our approach to that as a company at Sylvain is not to proselytize. We're not like coming to companies and being like activistic necessarily. Like our approach is like, how do you not leave your individual values at the door when you come into a project, and how do you solve the problem for them in a way that is like factoring in more constituencies, right? Like we go out and do research with different companies, customers or potential customers, and they tell us things about their lives. They tell us things that they wish were different. And if we can use that company's money, our mission is to leverage the might of corporations for the greater good. Like that's sort of like on our website, and our clients know that, but we're not coming in and saying like, you need to be an activist or you need to do this.
Yeah. You're not trying to change their business. We're going to factor those
things in. Yeah. But I've always said like, when people have asked, like, if you're working with X big company, like, how do you justify that within the context of this discussion of being a B Corp or orienting towards progress and the impact of our work. And I felt like this big company, right, whatever imaginary big company, it's not super relevant. Like if they're hiring someone to do a job, I would rather us show up and be factoring those things in. And if we can get that company to move 2 degrees in a positive direction versus like a smaller company that is like has social impact at the core of what they're doing, if we make them do a 180, but they're smaller, like the amount of impact and change we can create by moving Google 2 degrees in a positive direction versus Airtable 2 degrees in a positive direction is significant.
Right.
And so, we're not saying like coming in on some individual problem and then telling them that they should do other things across some part of the business that the person's not touching. But if we can, I find that like most people want to do good if they can. And if you show them a path that is sort of solving their problem while also factoring in these other things, like they're excited to do it. Like it makes them happy to be able to sort of do a positive thing that they weren't anticipating, but was sort of like in the cards for them.
Yeah. And you're not taking the protest track, which is, another viable way to go, but not an effective one for a business that serves its clients.
Right. Yeah. It's sort of like in the like positive assertion, negative assertion way. It's just sort of like, here's a solution that is better, that factors those things in, instead of telling someone not to do this thing, which is right. Like in like the old advice that people would tell you, like don't go to your boss with problems, go to your boss with solutions. Like it is the same type of thing. Instead of saying like, this is bad when you do this, you're saying like, do this instead. Here's the alternative.
And here's the proof from the voice of your customer that this is what they actually want, is this other better thing.
Yeah. And, it's also from like an intellectual perspective, I can tell you like, I told you earlier that, I'm excited by complex systems, just sort of like as a human, like the challenge is a little bit more difficult from an intellectual perspective. Like, how do you move this lever while also getting a positive effect with this other lever, right? Like instead of just saying like, how do I drive up sales, or how do I like increase revenue, which could tell you like, give people less goods in a smaller package, but charge, right? Like the sort of things that Elizabeth Warren is talking about in terms of like give less, or the news articles about like toilet paper packaging is getting smaller, but costs the same. Like, how do you do something that is better for someone, better for society, and better for the company? It's just like, it's more challenging. And that like for some subset of people who are like predisposed to become a strategist, like that's an exciting problem as opposed to like one that, certain people might want to shy away from. And
they tend to stay more engaged with problems that they can present a solution to versus here are 50 slides outlining a problem that we know you and the marketing team can't touch. That's a challenging place.
Yeah, I'm curious. I just know you're in the university environment. Like, can you see those same dynamics that people are talking about in terms of like the Great Resignation or things like that in the sort of discourse within the university? Like, do those same forces seem to be like working within academia or within like campus culture, or is the reality of like professional life not set in yet?
No, as I talk to people across industries and in higher ed, it's the same challenges, which is so ironic because I feel a sense of purpose being here in my job that I am contributing. But across the country, it's hit, that changeover as it was going on was hitting higher ed. It was hitting, just as bad as it was hitting any other industry, I think, of people just putting their tools down and walking off the job and going to find another thing. So that's a mystery to me. I would say, it's values. I don't think it is any one thing. But I think the way you laid out the idea of the complex system and its values, its autonomy, it's, hey, I just was pent up. I was cooped up for 2 years and I'm just going to make decisions that are more satisfying to myself, even For some people, I think the idea of telling someone they quit is like, that's a satisfying daydream that you have. And you go, I'm going to go do that now. Like, I don't like my boss and I'm going to go tell him I quit. That might be as far as they thought for some small segment, and I can't say that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's not probably when I was younger, I would have done that. I have a mortgage now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting to, there's like a lot of psychological research around sort of the fidelity of expectations, right? Like, how clear are your expectations of a potential future scenario to how disappointed you are in those outcomes, right? Like, if you think about a vacation ahead of going and you get really explicit, like, my room will look like this and the, beach will look like this and I'll be doing these things. And then it changes, even if it's not bad, the difference in expectation versus reality will create a sort of negative valence of emotion for a person. And there was a study that came out recently. I can share it with you if you want to put it in like show notes or something, but it was about graduates coming out of college this year having an expectation of their salary that was almost double what the market was sort of anticipating for entry-level roles for new graduates and things like that. And I think while that is sort of like one example around salary, I think what you're seeing is because of the level of discourse online and sort of this like broader discussion around ideals and the way things should be versus the way things are, there is more opportunity for people to be frustrated at the system as it exists today. And my fear in this sort of like broader, and maybe to sort of bring the discussion closer to a conclusion is that if expectations don't meet reality and you feel so frustrated that you turn towards this sort of nihilistic perspective, maybe a philosopher would correct me on the appropriate language. That's sort of like the shorthand I'm using, that there's not an opportunity to change things. If you think that like, if you move towards a point of learned helplessness or that it doesn't matter or it's meaningless, then it becomes difficult to make progress because progress takes sort of like some, maybe not a plurality of people, but a bunch of people moving towards something. And so
it just becomes a logjam. I mean, nothing moves forward because everybody's pulling in and all the leverage is going in different directions.
Yeah. And I think like that's where I worry. Like, I don't disagree sort of broadly with a lot of the ideals that you hear sort of raised in the discussions about like what should work be like or what should people be paid. Like in general, I'm like, yeah, like let's change things. Let's figure out how stuff should work.
And I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. And that's also a good idea.
Yeah.
And I could see the merit of that idea. Like it's all there's a lot of good ideas, but I don't think there's one universal company that can do every single idea they hear. And so there's always going to be something imperfect in any system that involves humans.
Yeah, it's sort of a perpetual pursuit of experimentation and trial and error. And, even when I talked about at the beginning, sort of like the distinction between theoretical neuroscience and applied neuroscience and where I was sort of like out from being in the lab, I think like the same reality is true when you look at complex systems. Like if you focus on a narrow individual thing, whether it's pay or like how many days is someone going in the office or whatever, if you isolate that problem, coming up with solutions can be easy and interesting. But when you start to apply those solutions, they have to still exist back in the complex system. And so it takes that trial and error, but it has to be like, okay, we're going to try this. Does it work? No, try something new. And you need like a certain level of resiliency against those failures because the failures are inevitable. I can tell you from the 12 years of this company, like the number of things that we thought might work and failed, and you just had to like lick your wounds and move on and try something new.
We tried, it didn't work.
Yeah, there's a lot of this.
Joey Camire, where can people find you online?
I mean, you can follow the company. I think the handle on Twitter is still at Sylvain Labs, because when we changed our name to Sylvain, we couldn't get the handle.
Some other creep.
Sylvain.co. Yeah, Sylvain.co is the company. We have a newsletter called Progress Report. You can find it on the website. It's just sort of around ideas like this of how do you sort of get that perpetual like momentum of changing and being better. And we have a podcast called Critical Nonsense, which is probably less serious than this, but still it's sort of just exploring like nerdy ideas in science, culture, and technology.
Very cool. Thank you so much for making time for me. I appreciate it. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. I appreciate you.
Got it.
Strategy Inside Everything is produced by me, Adam Pierno. If you like what you've heard, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Actually, I have no idea if that helps or if it's ever done anybody any good. If you really want to help the show and you like what you've heard, share it with someone else you think will dig it. That's the best way to help the show and keep the conversation growing. If you have an idea, a question, or want to push back, go to that'snotaninsight.com, where you can send me a message or leave me a voicemail that will be added to future shows. Music for the Strategy Inside Everything is by Saw Square Noise. For more information on me, you can go to adampierno.com to learn about my books, my speaking, and my consulting practice. Thanks for listening.